It's time for us now to go into the first of the main manifestations of the leg lock system. This is where the 6 essential skills of heel hooking and leg locking out of Ashigarami start to manifest themselves in a competitive setting. This is the straight Ashigarami system. We've defined earlier straight Ashigarami as any situation where my training partner's left leg goes straight across my right hip. Okay, at no point does my opponent's leg cross the center line. In situations like this, there are a vast number of Ashigarami variations that we can make use of. Most of the time, they start with what we're calling a rumi or standard Ashigarami. That doesn't have to be the case, however. When we work with this system, let's make an initial distinction which will run throughout the rest of this DVD. Whenever we have an Ashigarami, let's talk about the idea of a primary leg and a secondary leg. The primary leg will always be the one which is held inside my Ashigarami. So in this case, it's my training partner's left leg. The secondary leg will always be the one outside the Ashigarami. I can hold that with an arm. I can not hold it at all. In the case of a straight Ashigarami, I tend to face towards the secondary leg, which leaves towards the primary leg, which leaves the secondary leg a little bit behind me. That can cause problems as we work through the system that we'll look at. But for now, let's just bear in mind this simple idea that the primary leg is always the one held inside my Ashigarami, the secondary leg is the other one. When we work in this position, almost all the time we work, the outside heel hook will be our main method of attack. There are other forms of attack from this position, but this is the most commonly seen and in our experience the most effective one. We've seen quite a bit already about the mechanics in this position for breaking, but now we're going to look at the idea of controlling this position against resistance and a systematic use of our Ashigarami to control the general dynamic of this position and overcome a specific set of problems so we can get through to a heel hook win. I'm a big believer in what I often refer to as central problem theory. The idea that for any given scenario in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, there's usually at least one central problem which guides and motivates the actions of the two athletes in question. Sometimes you have more than one problem and they work concurrently and you've got to solve two problems at the same time. Sometimes it's just a single problem. More often than not, one problem takes priority. In the case of the outside Ashigarami situation, or in this case a straight Ashigarami situation, generally the problem we deal with is the shared spiral problem. Let's first understand what the problem is, and then ultimately we'll build a system around solving that problem. We know enough about the heel hook already to know that it ultimately exerts a spiraling force upon my opponent's leg. Once I start that turning force across my training partner, it's in his best interest to begin turning with it. If my opponent was naive and he tried to turn into the spiral, he would essentially break his own leg. That simply wouldn't make sense. So what most of your opponents are going to do when they feel some kind of threat from a heel hook, or even just the anticipation of a heel hook, is they will look to get out of the heel hook danger by spiraling in the same direction of force as the heel hook. They're doing two things at the same time. First, they're relieving pressure from the break, and secondly, they're going in a spiral against my Ashigarami. As a result, they get off their buttocks, which is the best breaking position for me. Then they can put a pushing force on my buttocks and start to play the distance game and bring their knee outside my knee line. So it accomplishes several desirable things at the same time. It reduces pressure, it takes them out of my best breaking position, and at the same time it enables them to free their knee outside of my knee line. It all starts with that turning action in the same direction as the pressure of my heel hook. Traditionally, heel hooks have always been taught with little regard to the distinction between the mechanism of control and the mechanism of breaking. As a result, for generations, most people applied their Ashigarami in the same direction as the heel hook. They took everything to the inside. As a result, the force of the Ashigarami matches the force of the heel hook. Remember from what we said earlier, I can always tell the direction of force of an ashigarami by the direction of the knees. As my knees point inwards, the force of my heel hook also goes inwards. And of course, my opponent's escape also goes inwards. And as a result, it's very easy for him to break away, and that's the inevitable result. For so long, you would often see this in competition. When heel hooks were applied on good opponents, they simply turned with the direction of the lock and made good their escape. Heel hooks ultimately got a bad reputation as a move that only tended to work up to a certain level and no further. Suddenly you had a group of athletes coming out of New York for whom turning escapes just didn't seem to work anymore. People turned against them and they still got through to the heel hook. What was different? Ultimately what we did is we came up with a way of dealing with the shared spiral problem, where I would set my ashigarami against my opponent's turn. There are two main ways we can do this. A simple method when I assess that the skill level of my opponent is not particularly high, and a sophisticated method which uses multiple ashigaramis when I assess that the skill level of my opponent is very good. If I have a single ashigarami working like so, I have a choice now between either staying with the initial ashigarami I had or changing to some other form of ashigarami. Thank you. I'm going to show first the idea of a simple single ashigarami approach to the shared spiral problem, which we tend to use against lower skilled opponents, and then probably the most well-known part of this aspect of the LegLock system, a multiple ashigarami approach, which we use on more sophisticated opponents. We're looking at the straight ashigarami system. The first aspect that I want to look at is a method of operating when we feel our opponent's skill level is perhaps not as high as you would expect at championship level. In situations like this, you needn't pull out the heavy artillery. You can work with a fairly simple rendition of the ashigarami system where only a single ashigarami is used, but there's some subtleties to it that need to be explained. Let's say that I have a basic arumi ashigarami locked in on my training partner. We know already that the force of an ashigarami is always revealed by the direction of the knees. We also know a lot about braking mechanics. You can put a shocking amount of braking force on your opponent just with a standard or arumi ashigarami. It's just that things have to be done very precisely. Once we get control of our training partner's heel and we start lining our fore-up with our training partner, we can put a huge amount of braking force just by coming up on our elbow and taking our hips off the floor. You'll notice that my inside leg moves over my training partner's thigh. So I'm lifting my pelvis off the mat and my left knee is pushing into my opponent's thigh. As a result, we get what we talked about earlier, contrary forces. My heel hook is going to my left, but my ashigarami is going to my right. And as a result, when I start lifting on the heel, you get very impressive braking power, given that you only have an arumi ashigarami. The big problem that most people had when they tried to work for success from here is that they took their ashigarami in the same direction as their brake, so that when the ashigarami goes in the same direction as the brake, my opponent simply rolls through and he's out and gone. If I'm going to use a simple single ashigarami to get the brake, I want to perfect the idea of rolling through with my training partner, but I've got to be conscious of where my knees are pointing throughout the duration of the move. If I lock up and I throw on a basic arumi ashigarami and go for the brake and I see my training partner turning violently against my heel hook, I will roll with him and I will go through and still end up in a position where my knees point against the second roll. And now the key is I get my hips off the floor. If my hips are on the mat and my opponent violently rolls in this direction, he'll carry me over with the roll. But when I take my hips off the mat and my opponent goes to roll, my body's in a straight line. It's very, very hard to move. And as a result, from here, we can bring the knees forward, the hips come in, our head lines up, and we get a very, very strong break, even though we only had one relatively simple form of Ashigarami throughout the entire breaking motion. Let's have a look at this again. We're looking at the application of a heel hook on an opponent who's perhaps not at championship level. So we're bringing out the simplest means of victory. My students would often use this when they fought in local competitions. And if you look at highlight reels of my student, you'll see that many of their early victories against lower echelon opponents came by this very simple but still very effective method. From a situation where I lock up on my training partner, I place the Ashigarami in. My knees are pointing opposite the heel hook. That never changes. Remember, we always want those contrary forces. Once I lock up, I want to commit body weight onto my training partner and go into a straight line. Very often you'll finish people just right from here. But if my opponent catches me on the hop and rolls straight through on me, I will keep my feet in position. And now we're ready to go into the extra horsepower. I lift my hips off the floor, so when he goes to roll a second time, it's awfully difficult. Now when I lift up on the heel, we get strong braking pressure because the knees are pushing against the heel hook itself. This very simple method works very well up to a certain level of competition. If you assess that your training partner or your opponent is at that level or underneath, this is more than enough to get a very simple and very effective finish. We're looking at the straight Ashigarami system. We just looked at a simplified version of it, which my athletes would often use when they fought in regional competitions. But you guys didn't come here to learn leg locking against inexperienced opponents. You came here to learn leg locking against highly skilled opponents. That's where the second part of the straight Ashigarami system comes in. This is the one which is most well known and most closely associated with myself and my students. This is the multiple Ashigarami system, where we use more than one Ashigarami to get a hold and finish of one lock. We're making a very strong distinction here between the Ashigaramis that control my opponent's legs and hips and the actual mechanism of breaking, the heel hook. Most people teach one Ashigarami and one heel hook and teach them as a unit. There's no real distinction made between the two. They just show the Ashigarami as part of the heel hook, and there's simply one Ashigarami per lock. A very distinctive feature of my students in competition is that when they come up against tough, skilled opponents, more often than not, in any straight Ashigarami situation, they will rotate through a series of Ashigaramis to get to that one lock that they were looking for. This makes it very difficult for your opponent to move out of or away from the threat of the heel hook. Whenever you use a single Ashigarami for one lock, you get a similar result to one-size-fits-all clothing. You won't be naked, but the result won't look good. So too with Ashigaramis. If I just use one Ashigarami to cover all the multiple skills required in a given heel hook scenario, you're going to end up with that same kind of one-size-fits-all outcome, where you get decent results but not optimal. Always remember, the task of heel hooking is actually a series of tasks, each of which is quite different. If we run through a basic heel hook, first we need some kind of entry and connection. That's the first task. We've seen that when it comes to that first task, the Arimi Ashigarami is very well adapted to it. It's a great way to enter and connect. Then we saw there's another task, the idea of exposing our training partner's heel. We're going to need a different form of Ashigarami for that. Then we need to negate our opponent's attempts to escape. We'll need a different form of Ashigarami for that. And then finally, we're going to have to break our opponent. And we'll need a fourth form of Ashigarami for that task. When you understand heel hooking as a collection of tasks rather than a single task, that's when you start to understand you're going to need more than one Ashigarami at the elite levels of the sport, even for a single lock. If there's 4 distinct tasks and no one Ashigarami can cover all 4 of those tasks adequately, you're going to need the skill of switching from ashigarami to ashigarami to ashigarami all the way through, choosing the appropriate one in a minimal amount of time to get to the results that you want. Let's understand exactly what those 4 skills involved in an outside heel hook are. We've already hinted at the first. This is entry and connection. Earlier, we looked at the idea of an Arimi Ashigarami. Let's quickly summarize what we saw. We saw that we need scissored legs that close in virtue of the fact that we have a shoelace in a straight buttock position, like so, knee and ankle locked together, and our weight over our training partner's ankle, so that if my opponent should go to move away from me, I feel a strong sense of connection. If my opponent should go to rotate out of the lock, I should be able to stay on my training partner very, very easily. So that's always our first skill when we come into a straight ashigarami. We have to be able to form a sense of connection to our opponent. The method we use, or the ashigarami that we use to cover that task, is always the Arimi Ashigarami. We're looking at the straight ashigarami system. We've seen that the first task that we must complete is the task of entry and connection. We've seen the single best and most commonly used method of accomplishing this is the Arimi or entering ashigarami. Okay. Once we get that sense of connection to our opponent, our next thing is to expose our training partner's heel. Now, this is where things get interesting. If I try to expose my opponent's heel using the same Arimi Ashigarami that I used to enter my opponent's legs, problems start to develop immediately. First, when my opponent goes to hide his heel inside my hip like so, if I should try to go down to a shoulder and dig for my training partner's heel, I render myself very vulnerable immediately. I've unweighted my top leg, in this case the inside leg here. If my opponent pulls that leg, if my opponent pulls that leg over the top, he's now exposed my heel to his heel hook. He has exactly the same ashigarami on me, but I don't have a heel and he does. When he starts to apply pressure on me, I've got to pull the panic buttons now. Okay, I'm in a heel hook, he's not. And as a result, I can quickly get finished in this position. Moreover, coming down to a shoulder makes it very, very difficult for me to actually physically lift my opponent's heel and expose it. So if I stay with the original Arimi Ashigarami and I try to go down and dig and expose a heel, I'm making myself extremely vulnerable. A much better strategy is to simply switch ashigaramis. I'm going to make a switch from a standard or Arimi Ashigarami, and I'm going to go to an inside ashi, where I take my foot on my training partner's hip and I shift my hips to the outside. As a result, I immediately lift my opponent's heel off the mat and generate heel exposure. I don't want my opponent turning and slipping his heel, so I make sure I pass my foot across the center line. I take the center of my calf muscle right over the center of my training partner's quadricep, and as a result we create a strong reaping effect in this direction. When my opponent tries to turn back in, and slip the heel, it's extremely difficult now because of the action of my leg across the center line. Once again, if I start off in an Arimi Ashigarami and I try to go down to the heel and expose it, he simply has to hide the heel, and now he's got a hold of me. I'm fighting for survival now. He has an exposed heel on me. I certainly don't have an exposed heel on him. So, rather than unweight my inside leg and make myself vulnerable to a simple counter, we're going to stay propped up on our elbow and shift our hips to the outside. I'm going to pass my foot across my opponent's thigh, that reaping action that immediately exposes my training partner's heel. When he tries to turn back in this direction to slip the heel, that leg across the center, that reaping action makes it exceptionally difficult. We've got an exposed heel now, and we're ready to start playing into the next aspect of the game. It's time now to go into our third distinct task of heel hooking in straight ashigarami. We've seen our first task is always entry and connection. We've seen the appropriate ashigarami for this is Arimi Ashigarami. Our second, very distinct task is to expose our training partner's heel. We've seen a good way for us to do this is the use of an inside ashigarami, where I pass my foot across the inside and expose the heel. The moment you expose your heel and get this grip, your opponent knows exactly where you want to go. You want to apply a braking force on your opponent's leg, and they know the appropriate thing to do now is to begin turning in the same direction as the braking force in order to relieve pressure. Now, once we go into this position, this is where most heel hooks are lost. This idea of negating my opponent's resistance is absolutely critical to your success in the heel hook game. Ultimately, I want to put a spiraling, turning force on my opponent's leg. If I stay with this inside ashigarami, I enable my opponent to turn in the same spiral that I'm going through, not what we want. There's a danger that as my opponent turns and I stay with this ashigarami, you get something very undesirable. Our knee is pointing in the opposite direction of his knee. My knee is pointing up to the ceiling. My training partner's knee is pointing down to the floor. That means that when he takes his other foot and props it on my hips, any push on his part will immediately slip his knee outside of my knee line. It's absolutely critical that when it comes time to negate resistance in this position, our knees point in the same direction. I'll do this again from another angle so you can see exactly what's going on. Here, I've taken my feet to the inside. My opponent pops up to his base, and from here you can clearly see that my knee is facing up to the ceiling. My opponent's knee is pointing down to the floor. That creates a hole in my ashigarami that my opponent can readily exploit. As he pushes, his knee spirals out, and now his knee is gone from my knee line. As a result, the move itself is completely lost. It is absolutely critical in these situations that once we bring our foot to the inside ashi position, I learn to point my knee in the same direction as his knee. The best way for me to do this is to take my inside leg out and lock a senkaku over my training partner's far hip, the so-called far hip ashigarami. I can't be naive here. I can't leave my foot exposed to his figure 4 toe hold, which would create a strong counter on his part. We want to make sure we hide our foot in the hip, and we also want to make sure that we already have our opponent's heel. If I do not have my opponent's heel, I would never be so bold as to put my foot over someone's hip in this fashion. I do this because I'm confident that I already have the man's heel under my control. Now, if he goes to reach for a figure 4 toe hold, my foot is in an inconvenient position and I'm already putting braking pressure on him. That means he's going to have to commit his hands to the floor and go into a defensive movement. Now I focus on pointing my knee at the mat. We've got something interesting now. Both of our knees are pointing down to the floor. That means when he goes to put a foot on my buttocks or go to kick his way out of this position, he could go as strong as he wants. Let's go. He'll never kick out. Even if he runs along the mat now, he'll simply drag me along the floor, but the grip will not break. If my knee pointed the opposite direction and he ran along the floor, it would quickly result in an escape. But when our two knees share the same direction and my two legs back heel strongly back in, I have the heel hook in place. When he goes to run along the mat, he simply drags me along the floor and there's no loss of contact. His knee never comes out from my knee line, and I can continue with this braking pressure that will lead us into the next element. Let's have a look at this again. From a situation where we've locked up successfully with our training partner, we're starting to break down heel hook into a collection of skills rather than, as most people see it, a single skill. Once you see it as a collection of skills, in this case 4 distinct skills, you're going to start to understand you're going to need a different ashigarami to cover each skill. Remember, no one ashigarami adequately covers all the 4 skills of heel hooking, in this case the outside heel hook. We know that when we first enter, the Arimi ashigarami is very well adapted for this task. However, it is poorly adapted for the next task, heel exposure. When I try to go down to a heel, I end up exposing my own foot to counters. We don't want that, obviously. So a better way for me to operate is to switch to a new form of ashigarami, the inside ashigarami. This immediately exposes my training partner's foot. However, the inside ashigarami is poorly adapted for the next element of the heel hook game, which is negating my opponent's resistance. If I stay with a simple inside ashi, my opponent can easily pop up to his base and exploit my poor knee position by kicking out, and I lose a leg. So it's very important we go to our next phase of this game, where once we have a hold on our training partner's heel, I throw my leg over the far hip and back heel. This minimizes the exposure of my foot to a counter, and, of course, I already have my opponent's heel. So even if he went hunting for my foot, you already have your game in place. Now, because I have that far hip ashi, I can turn my knee in the same direction as my opponent. As a result, when he goes to run out of the lock, there's simply no way he can break the contact. You're stuck onto your opponent in a way which is exceptionally difficult for him to get away from. Not only does this stop turn and run options, it stops a host of other effective methods of going out of heel hooks. For example, a very popular form of escape in these situations is a step over, a back step over, where my opponent steps over my legs and into a situation where he crosses my legs and defeats the ashigarami. However, when I lock the far hip ashigarami and he goes to perform the same exercise, he merely carries me into the next phase that we'll be looking at very shortly. We're looking at the straight ashigarami system. The big innovation that I brought into the straight ashigarami game was the idea that there are more than one task involved. In fact, there are a minimum of 4 major tasks involved in any basic heel hook from a straight ashigarami. That first skill is always going to be entry and connection. It's important to understand that for each of the 4 skills, you're going to need an appropriate ashigarami. No one ashigarami is going to cover all 4 disparate skills. Once we get into this situation, we begin with the arimi ashigarami. That's how we connect to our opponent. That's how we control our opponent's knee inside our knee line and maintain it long enough. However, this is not a good ashigarami to expose a heel. We've seen already today that we need to be able to expose our opponent's heel to create a viable threat in this position. If I try and expose a heel from an arimi ashigarami, I expose myself to my opponent and end up getting broken myself. A better way for us to act is to turn across our training partner's leg and use the inside ashigarami to quickly lock up on my training partner like so. Once we get the heel exposure, your opponent's going to go into a very predictable series of defensive maneuvers, most of which involve turning in the same direction as the heel hook. We've seen that in these situations we want to lock a senkaku over our training partner's far hip and use an action known as back heeling, where my heels pinch back towards my own buttocks to tighten up the grip. As my opponent goes up into a defensive position, I point my knee in the same direction that his knee is pointing, so that when he tries to get out from here, it's very, very difficult. Once we get to this position, we apply braking pressure. It is so important when we do this that we be down on our shoulders. I never want to do this propped up on my elbow. This is a mechanically weak position. I want my hands locked down on my shoulder. From here, I apply pressure on the heel hook. If my opponent doesn't move and just stays where he is, you'll get braking pressure very rapidly in this position. So of course he has to turn. When he does so, my 2 feet lock on the outside of my training partner's hips, and we find ourselves now in the penultimate aspect of this heel hook game, the outside ashigarami. This is the braking position most often associated with my students in any straight ashigarami situation. From here, my 2 legs are now on the outside of my opponent's hip, and from here, our ashigarami is pointing in one direction and the heel hook is going in the exact opposite. Moreover, Because my ankles are locked, we now have what we call a closed set of wedges around our opponent's legs. Unlike in a Rimi Ashigarami, where the wedges are open and my opponent can push feet and start to separate my legs, in the case of outside Ashigarami, my legs cross. When he tries to separate the feet, crossed feet are so much harder to separate than uncrossed legs. And as a result, it's very, very hard for our opponent to get out in the time available. The outside Ashigarami is by far and away the most efficient breaking position in the sport, at least as far as straight heel hooks go. Whenever we can use it, we always do so. We tend to use it as the final step in a sequence of Ashigaramis. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time now just going over the sequence until it starts to feel natural for you. It's important that we be able to go from Ashigarami to Ashigarami in a smooth, flowing sequence, not chopping from one to the other. We know that starting from here, we get good control of our opponent. When he goes to move away, it's difficult for our opponent to do so. We're locked in. We have excellent control of the knee inside the knee line. When it's time to expose a heel, the inside Ashi is an excellent way to do it. When it's time to negate our training partner's resistance and turn and spin away, the far hip Ashi does an excellent job. Now, from the far hip Ashi, our knees point down, we put sufficient pressure on our opponent that he begins to turn. Watch how my legs transition to the outside. Then a back heel action pulls my hips in towards my training partner's hips. As a result, we get tremendous braking pressure with just a minimal amount of movement. Done in this way, we can put severe braking pressure on opponents in a matter of millimeters and, more importantly, in a matter of seconds. I'm going to run through some of these transitions without talking, just showing you how we go smoothly from one situation through three more and getting into our favorite braking position from a variety of angles. Let's look at one of the most common errors whenever I teach this fundamental sequence. This is the error of rolling across an elbow. It's absolutely critical that you learn to roll efficiently across your shoulders. When I lock, my hands lock in place. I want to roll efficiently across my shoulders. This enables me to follow my opponent's roll very, very smoothly. Remember, we're in a shared spiral. There's a sense in which I cannot let my opponent's attempt to spiral outpace my own. If his spiral is faster than mine, I'm going to lose the Ashigarami every single time, because essentially there's a race going on here, and it's a race between our two knees. What do I mean by this? If I get into this position, there's a race between my knee and his to point to the floor. If my opponent spins rapidly and his knee points to the floor before mine, he's gone. What I need is to ensure that as his knee points towards the floor, mine goes with him. That means that I must roll at least the same speed as my training partner. Again, if my knee travels more slowly than his and he turns, that's the inevitable result, an escape. However, if my knee goes at the same speed as his, he'll never escape because our knees now share the same direction. The number one thing that will screw up my ability to follow the speed of his roll is a poor use of my left elbow. So often I see athletes do this. They lock up with a single hand, and as their opponent goes to turn, they come up to an elbow. This slows down my turn dramatically and makes it very easy for my opponent to kick out, and he's gone. You must avoid this temptation. It's a common error and not one you should be making. When I lock, don't come up to a supporting elbow. It dramatically slows your turn and greatly facilitates your opponent's attempts at escape. Keep your hands locked and roll efficiently across your shoulders, where you can easily follow your opponent's motion. Let's look one more time at this very common error and how it can be avoided. Here's the mistake. I go through and I keep a single hand on. He goes to turn. I try to prop on an elbow. It slows me down in an awkward position and the leg is lost. Let's contrast that with a situation where my opponent goes to turn and I lock my hands and roll smoothly over my shoulders, pull my body in, and we've got finishing pressure. Let's make sure that we understand the real problem of the shared spiral. It's a problem of pace. If my opponent's knee outpaces mine, his spiral will take him out and away and he'll escape. I need a smooth ability to roll and keep the pace of my spiral shared with the pace of his spiral. If I can do this, I can follow him through those 4 different ashigaramis and get to the ultimate braking position, the outside ashigarami, and create tremendous braking pressure on my opponent's leg. Let's go through in more detail a critical aspect that will greatly help your conceptual understanding of the straight ashigarami system and the idea of multiple ashigaramis per heel hook. It's very, very important you understand the distinct roles of the inside leg and the outside leg and how we cycle between inside leg dominance and outside leg dominance. What do I mean by this? We know that when we work with any straight ashigarami, we have an inside leg and an outside leg. The inside leg, of course, is the one that's between my training partner's legs. The outside leg is the one which is here on the outside of the thigh and hip. It's very important to understand that at any given moment, one of your legs will be the dominant partner in this 2 versus 1 relationship. If my knee, the inside leg, is pointing outwards, typically I will be inside leg dominant. Most of the force comes from the push of my inside leg over my opponent's thigh. Do you remember when we went through the simplified version of finishing from this position? We applied heel hook pressure from an Arumi ashigarami, and we saw that if we had opponents who were perhaps not the highest skill level, we could do just fine with that simplified finish. We saw that if we had a heel hook and an Arumi ashigarami, as long as my inside leg was pushing and scissoring over my training partner's thigh, we would get tremendous braking pressure with which we could finish opponents. However, we saw that if we don't have our opponent's heel, inside leg dominance was not a good way to expose our opponent's heel. When we were inside leg dominant, it tended to create exposure of our inside leg to our opponent. So we saw that from an initial start where we were inside leg dominant, my inside leg on top of my opponent's thigh, pushing down, exerting most of the force of the ashigarami. And remember guys, we always know the force of the ashigarami is revealed by the direction of our knees. So when my inside leg is pushing across to the outside, you know that's the primary working leg here. Now, we saw in order to expose our opponent's heel, we had to switch which leg was dominant. We had to put our foot on the hip and use a reaping action with the outside leg to expose the heel. Now my knees are pointing in the opposite direction, and you can clearly see it's my outside leg now which is the dominant partner in the ashigarami. It's the one exerting most of the force on my opponent. By pushing across the thigh muscle, I've exposed my training partner's hip. But this creates a new problem, my opponent can now begin a defensive turn in this direction, which I have to match and lock my legs in the so-called far hip ashigarami. Now, as I put pressure on my opponent, I come out the opposite side, and lo and behold, my knees are now pointing in the opposite direction. I've switched to the ultimate form of inside leg dominance, where now the inside leg has crossed over and I've crossed my feet, locking the inside leg in place so that when I go to apply pressure, we get immediate results. In the space of a few seconds, perhaps even less, we've cycled from inside leg dominance to two forms of outside leg dominance back to a form of inside leg dominance. And that all happened in a very short period of time. That kind of leg mastery of knowing what you're trying to do with both inside and outside leg is a huge part of your development in this aspect of the game. Let's go through it again and hopefully we can make more sense of it. Let's face in this direction so you can see a different angle. From here, I start with an Arumi Ashigarami. You can clearly see my knees are pointing to the outside. My inside leg is in the top position and it's the one exerting most of my force on my opponent. If I wanted a simplified finish, I could do it right from here, just through the use of the inside leg, scissoring across the thigh. As a result, we get very, very strong braking pressure. Okay. However, if I don't have the heel, I may have to cycle the outside leg across and switch to an outside leg form of Ashigarami. Here the outside leg is dominant. You can clearly see there's a reaping action which has exposed my training partner's heel. Now, with that same outside leg dominance, I lock a triangle over my training partner's far hip and I motivate my opponent to turn by applying heel hook pressure. At this point, if I just tried to finish here, my opponent could step over my body and from here ultimately start coming forward into his escapes. That's obviously not what I want. So it's important, whether he steps or whether I force him to step through the heel hook pressure, that I turn with my opponent. And now clearly you can see my legs are pointing out. My inside leg is in the top position, pressuring down on my training partner's thigh. And as a result, we get tremendous braking pressure. Again, in a matter of seconds, we've gone through a cycle of inside leg dominance to outside leg dominance, back to inside leg dominance. And it's from the inside leg dominance that we do our braking. We expose the heel and get our training partners rolling with outside leg dominance. But when it's time to brake, we want to be inside leg dominant. Learning to cycle rapidly, smoothly, and efficiently through the inside and outside leg dominance in a matter of seconds is going to be one of the key elements that helps you to work successfully in a competitive setting. We've been looking at the straight Ashigarami system. We've seen that there's a simplified way that we can act when we have opponents who perhaps are not at the highest level of leg lock development, and we can just go into a single Ashigarami and break out of really the simplest of them all, the Arumi Ashigarami. But when it's time to deal with sophisticated opponents with good defensive skills, most of the time we like to work through an approach which involves multiple Ashigaramis within a very short time frame, covering 4 distinct skills with 4 distinct Ashigaramis to get through into a braking position. We've seen that the fundamental problem that we always face is this problem of the shared spiral. That as we go to apply a spiraling force on our opponent's leg, their escape direction is in the same spiral as our attacking force. As a result, there's a danger you can just spiral together without result. We've seen that learning to catch up to our opponent's spiral is key to keeping him locked in our Ashigarami so we can go through into our favorite braking position. But let's understand something very clearly. We don't want to continually share the same spiral as our opponent. Remember, the end game is not to share the spiral. The end game is to stop the spiral. You have to be able to move with your opponent's spiral for a certain period of time and ultimately stop it. Because only when you stop the spiral do you have a stationary opponent upon which you can exert a force that will break his leg. If you both just keep turning and turning together, at no point do you have a static opponent where you can exert a braking force. Every time you go to apply the force, he's turning with you. So remember, the end game is not to share the spiral. We do that so that we can move with our opponent and prevent escape. But the end game is to stop the spiral, lock him on his hips, and break his leg. Let's look at how this is done. Ultimately, of course, it's done through the use of the so-called outside ashigarami. We know that we start off with an orimi ashigarami. We know that's an excellent way to connect to our opponent, but we need to go into some form of inside ashigarami to expose the heel. Once we get heel exposure, we need to be able to catch up to and maintain our movement with our opponent's spiraling escapes. Most of his escapes in this position involve a spiral, which I must move with. Now, once we get to this position, there's a danger that we could just keep rolling forever. And as we roll and roll, we either go out of bounds, which will get you separated, or you'll simply fail to get sufficient braking pressure, and at some point, if you keep rotating long enough, he's probably going to free his knee. So it's critical that once we get a roll through, we want to stop the spiral as soon as possible. Remember, the end game is to stop the spiral, not to share it. Once I get my opponent rolling in this position, I want to ultimately set my body against his spiral, so that as I make a switch, just stop right there, currently we're outside leg dominant. And as a result, we're able to turn rapidly and efficiently with our opponent. But as I turn across my body and I switch to inside leg dominance, I want to set my ashigarami against him so that my knees point in the opposite direction of the spiral. His spiral is going west and my knees are going east. In addition, I take my hips off the floor and elevate the hips, so there's weight over his leg. If my hips are on the floor and my chest starts to face the ceiling, we simply go into a second spiral. It's absolutely critical here that I take my hips off the floor and we find ourselves with high hips. Now when my opponent goes to continue the spiral, he'll break his own leg if he tries. As my opponent is immobilized, now when I apply my force, I get the break. Remember, we need a static opponent in order to exert a true braking force upon the leg. Let's have a look at this whole very important sequence again. We start off with a standard or a orimi ashigarami. We transfer to an inside, we've gone to outside leg dominance, and as a result, we've got the heel. Now when we lock up, we lock over our training partner's hip and we start sharing the spiral together. However, we can't go on just spiraling. Once we share the spiral and my knee points in the same direction as his, we know that escape is going to be very difficult for him now. But as we come out of the spiral, ultimately I want to stop the spiral, and I do it by pointing my knees in the opposite direction of his spiral. His spiral is going west, my knees are going east. From here, I bring my hips off the floor. I put my body into a straight line, and as a result, you have devastating braking pressure on a static opponent. And that's always the ultimate goal of the straight ashigarami system. We've been looking in some detail at a system working towards an outside heel hook from a straight ashigarami scenario. We've seen from any straight ashigarami, we have 4 essential tasks that need to be fulfilled if we're going to successfully heel hook someone. The first was the idea of entry and connection, and we saw that we used a given ashigarami, a orimi ashigarami, to achieve that. Then we had to expose our training partner's heel, so we brought our foot across to the inside and exposed that heel and got a good grip. Then we had to go to negate our opponent's resistance. Now, the method we used was to lock a far hip ashigarami, where I took my inside leg over my training partner's hip and locked the figure of 4 over the far hip. Then from here, as we went to apply pressure, we negated resistance by pointing our knee down towards the mat. So when my opponent tries to move out away from us, we're locked in place. If he tries to backstep over the leg, we can easily follow and then make the transition into the finishing position outside Ashigarami. And from here, we've got a strong finishing position. Now, that general methodology of using 4 different Ashigaramis to cover 4 different tasks is one excellent way that we can operate in this position and get through to a strong braking position. But it would be a mistake to say that's the only way of doing things. It's definitely one of my favorite ways of operating. It's one that my students have had tremendous success with over the years. But as I said, there's always more than one way of doing things. Let's look now at a different way of approaching this cycle of movement that ends in a strong break in outside Ashigarami. Let's look at it in a different way, and in a way which I think will be very illustrative of some of the important points that will deepen your knowledge of the Ashigarami game in general and of the outside heel hook system in particular. The first thing I want you to focus on is the idea of direction of force with Ashigarami. It's very important you understand that you can tell merely by looking at any given Ashigarami what the direction of force of that Ashigarami is. It's revealed by one infallible sign, and that's the direction of the man's knees. Where are his knees pointing? Because wherever the knees point, that's the direction of force of any given Ashigarami. So say for example here I have a standard or a rumi Ashigarami. You can clearly see my knees are pointing out in this direction. That's where the force of the Ashigarami will be applied. So if I were to apply a heel hook from this position, the Ashigarami will reveal the direction of power applied through my hips. Okay? In this case it's the correct direction against my heel hook. The moment my knees start turning, you can see the force of the Ashigarami is turning, and look at the effect that it has upon my opponent's positioning. You'll see his head move as my Ashigarami rotates. Okay? So this is a very important point. You should be able to look across a room at an Ashigarami being employed by an athlete some 20 meters away. In the blink of an eye, you should be able to identify what's the direction of force of that Ashigarami merely by looking at the athlete's knees. Now, once you start to understand this, you can start to make some very interesting assertions and modifications to this idea of how am I going to put someone into an outside heel hook. It's not always necessary, and in some cases not even desirable, to make switches from one Ashigarami to another. I don't have to change the Ashigarami if I can merely change the orientation of my knees. If we understand that directionality of force is revealed by the knees and my knees can change orientation, I may not have to change from one Ashigarami to another. I could have one Ashigarami and cycle not through different Ashigaramis, but through different orientations of my knees, and in this way cover the 4 essential skills of heel hooking. Let's change our body angle so you can see this more clearly. From a situation where I start off with my training partner, I'm going to apply a rumi Ashigarami. Now, let's be very clear about this. The way I apply a rumi Ashigarami is a little different from most. If you look at most people applying a basic Ashigarami, they'll put their foot, the shoelaces of their foot, under the same leg that they're locking, like so. Okay? When I apply an rumi Ashigarami, I almost always put my foot on the opposite leg at the hamstring. Okay, this is so that we satisfy the demand for double trouble, that both legs are being controlled as much as possible. So we lock up in a rumi Ashigarami with the foot on the opposite leg here, what we often refer to as a double rumi Ashigarami, because both legs are being controlled, as opposed to here where only a single leg is being controlled. Okay? Once we get into this position, I don't always have to change from one Ashigarami to another to be able to cover the 4 essential skills of heel hooking. Here, the double arumi forms a very good solid connection to my opponent. Without even changing my foot position, but only changing the orientation of my knees, I can generate heel exposure. Now when I lock up, instead of putting my foot over the top, I keep it where it is, locked underneath my opponent's far knee, just like so. This forms a hook underneath my training partner's leg. When I go to apply heel hook pressure, you can see that my left foot functions as a sticky hook. I'll explain that in a few minutes. Right there on the back of my training partner's knee. When he goes to spin and move around, when he goes to move away from me, etc., I'm hooked into him through that inside leg hooking behind his knee. The presence of my left foot behind his knee regulates the speed of his rotation, the speed of his spiral. And as a result, I'm able now to move through on my opponent and keeping that same foot position without ever changing it. I keep the tension in my left foot and I can apply a very strong heel hook finish without ever changing from one ashigarami to another. In this case, I kept a single ashigarami and went through the cycle of all 4 tasks involved in heel hooking with just one ashigarami. But something else changed. Even though I didn't change ashigaramis, I changed the orientation of my knees to cover each one of those 4 tasks. Let's go back into this in some more detail. The concept which I often use with my students in any kind of butterfly guard or ashigarami work is what we call a sticky hook. Now, I got some explaining to you. What the hell is a sticky hook? If you stand over me, most people, when they put feet in behind their training partner's legs, don't really exert much force on their opponent, and as a result, it's very easy for them to pommel legs out of there and move around. A sticky hook refers to a situation where there's an active force through my shoelaces into the back of my training partner's knees, so that if his leg went to move, he went to step, for example, I would follow and move my opponent, and I can move and disrupt my training partner's balance through the use of these sticky hooks. Wherever his foot goes, my leg follows, and as a result, you get very strong disruptive kazushi out of this. Okay, you can control your training partner's legs through these hooks which stick and follow your opponent's movement. That's essentially what we're doing here in this double Arumi Ashigarami situation. Once I get in to the double Arumi and I turn my knees, you'll see that my left foot is sticking to him. If I just had my left foot inert behind him, he could easily pommel his foot out of there, move around, etc., etc. Okay? Obviously, we don't want that. So there has to be some kind of strong application of force through my shoelaces into the back of his leg so that my foot literally sticks to the back of the inside of his knee. So from here, look how I turn the knees and there's that sticky hook. The beauty of the sticky hook is that it makes me completely in control of the speed of my opponent's spiral. Let's understand something very clearly. When my opponent goes to spiral out of these moves, the speed of his spiral is enormously important. Not just the speed of his spiral, but the speed of his spiral relative to mine. Remember, I'm exerting a turning, twisting, spiraling force on his heel. That's the base of a heel hook, is it's a twisting lock. If we both spiral at the same speed, if the speed of his spiral matches the speed of application of force of the heel hook, I will never break him because he's moving at the same spiraling speed that I am. So as I go to put a turning pressure on his ankle and he goes to rotate with me, if we rotate at the same speed, we'll just keep rotating and rotating until eventually he's gone. Even worse is a situation where his spiral is faster than my spiral. That's completely intolerable because now he will actually escape the move. Let's switch positions. Again, if our spiral is exactly the same speed, we'll just roll and roll without result until eventually we go out of bounds. Even worse is a situation where his spiral is faster than mine. If I go like so, he's out, he's gone. Okay? So at a minimum, I need to have my spiral the same speed as his and then stop him. Remember, your goal when you go to heel hook people is ultimately to create a static opponent. If he's spiraling the same degree, the same rate that you're spiraling, you will never break him. If he's spiraling faster than you, he will actually physically escape from your ashigarami. So I must be at a minimum able to keep up with his spiral and then stop him to break him. Okay, that's the minimum. Now the way we saw that is we were doing it by locking a far hip ashigarami. The beauty of the far hip ashigarami is that whatever speed he goes, I go. It literally locks me to him. But then when we land on the other side, we've switched to an outside ashigarami. This puts weight over my opponent's leg so that when he goes to continue the spiral, he can't. And that's when you break him. Remember, your goal when you heel hook is to create a static opponent. When he's stationary and you're spiraling, his leg's going to break. But if you're both spiraling together, no one's leg's going to break. And if he's spiraling faster than you, he'll spiral right out of your ashigarami. So the whole thing is to create a situation where you have a static opponent upon whom you can apply a spiraling or twisting force. Now, the far hip ashigarami connects me to my opponent extremely well, and it enables me to follow his spiral quite easily until I can make the switch to an outside ashigarami and then break him. But even better than that is the sticky hook, because then you're not just following your opponent's spiral, you're dominating the speed of the spiral. You can actually stop him or slow him down dramatically. So it goes even further, and in some ways even better than the far hip ashigarami. When I lock in on my training partner and I put that sticky hook in behind, when he goes to spiral as fast as he can, you dramatically slow him down. Okay? Even if we spiral several times, you will have it functions like a brake upon your opponent's ability to move. So you see, as he goes into the move, I put so much pressure over his body, just slow him down and bring the rate of his spiraling down until eventually you can go into your favorite finishes. In addition to dramatically slowing down your opponent's spiral, it also provides a very interesting way of putting contrary or coupled forces into your opponent's leg. When I put my sticky hook on the far side, when my opponent goes to rotate out of the lock, from here I will often use that sticky hook to put a strong force into my opponent's secondary leg. When he tries to turn in this direction, it's so difficult. I take my own hips off the floor, and now we've got a wedge on the floor for my right knee and a hook on his leg with my left foot. When he goes to spin out, he's rendered stationary by those two contrary forces. And from here, now it's an easy thing for me to lift the heel off the mat and generate very, very strong braking forces. So we've got an interesting alternative way of controlling my opponent's movement. And fascinatingly, it's done through this principle of double trouble. By controlling my opponent's secondary leg with my sticky hook, you dramatically slow down and interfere with their ability to spiral. Done properly, you can literally dominate that spiral between you and your opponent. And as a result, you'll create the stationary opponent that you're looking for to exert a braking force. So one more time. Instead of me switching from one ashigarami to another, I just change the orientation of my knees. That's all I do. And by doing so, we get heel exposure. Now, when he goes to move out, I negate my opponent's resistance through that sticky hook. Now when we come over the top, I have contrary forces because my knees are pointing down to the right while my heel hook goes up to the left. And as a result, when he tries to move away, he feels jammed in place. And now, when we lift the heel, we get a tremendously powerful finish. Now, a natural question for you to ask at this point is, okay, you've just shown me two very different ways of hitting this outside heel hook. One was a cycle of ashigaramis covering the four basic tasks of heel hooking. The other was just one ashigarami, but four different knee orientations. Which one should I choose? Okay. That's a good question, and the answer to it reveals a lot about what you must start to see in yourself as you start working your way up to the expertise of leg locking. There comes a certain point where there's no real right or wrong answer. Essentially what you've got here is a choice between double trouble on the one hand and closed wedges versus open wedges on the other. The beauty of the double Urumi Ashigarami is that it does control both the secondary leg and the primary leg. Okay, it puts a very, very strong control through that sticky hook on my opponent's secondary leg. So both legs are being controlled. That's one of its great features. Another great feature is that because my foot is underneath my opponent's legs, it's very hard for him to do any kind of counter leg lock to me, as opposed to a far hip ashi where there's always some danger, however small, of him performing some kind of counter lock. It's unlikely, but it is, it's always possible. Down here, much less so. There's still counters he can do. Trust me on that, but less so. In addition, there's slightly less back exposure. Okay, when I finish in an outside ashigarami, there is some degree of back exposure if I lose my opponent's heel. Okay, when I have double Urumi, there's much less because my two knees face him much more square on. So there are some definite advantages to this method of working with the inside sticky hook underneath my opponent's legs. We've got a choice here between hooking with the far hip ashi, where the control goes over my opponent's hip from the top, versus the sticky hook going under my opponent's leg from the bottom. Okay, we've seen this idea that when I work with that sticky hook, we're controlling both of our opponent's legs. It comes at a price, however. And that price is the wedges around my opponent's primary leg are open. So that when I go to attack, my opponent could, for example, pommel his foot inside, underneath, and now start attacking my leg. Let's look at that again. Here, my foot was under. If he pommels successfully and goes through, now my leg is exposed. Okay. In addition, because it's an open wedge, there's a danger my opponent could stuff my ashigarami foot, the outside foot, down and start hopping over my foot and escaping. So essentially what we've got here is a choice. Which one should I choose? Well, that will depend upon which one of these principles you tend to emphasize more. Is double trouble more important to you? Or is the principle of closed wedges more important? And in truth, there's no right or wrong answer to that. It's going to come down to your own individual preference and to some degree your experience dealing with the context that you're in. This is an important point because as you go higher and higher in the sport of jiu-jitsu, it becomes harder and harder to nail down right or wrong answers to the various questions that you pose to yourself. The higher you go, many of the answers you give will have to be based on the idea of your individuality as an athlete and of the context that you're in, judged upon your experience. When someone's a complete beginner, most of the questions they ask have an obvious right or wrong answer to them. But the higher you go, the less that is the case. And here we've got a good example of this. Which one should I choose? Should I, for example, go over the top, like so, and lock in the far hip ashi? There's certain pros to that. Okay. Should I finish here in the outside ashigarami? There's certainly good elements to it. It's a nice, strong, closed wedge. Or should I just stay with one ashigarami? Let's use that sticky hook and cycle through and finish like so. Okay. As we said, ultimately, this is going to come down to which one of those primary principles do you favor the most? Are you more of a double trouble kind of a guy, or are you more of a closed wedges kind of a guy? There's no right or wrong choosing between those. They're both important principles of the LegLock system that I espouse. Typically what you'll find is as you go higher and higher, you'll have to make snap judgments based upon the situation you find yourself in and your own individual preferences. As I said, there's no clear right or wrong. Nonetheless, my personal favorite is actually a mix of the two. I personally very much like the idea of the sticky hook to slow down my opponent. I like the idea of dominating the speed of my opponent's spiral rather than merely following it. However, I'm also a huge fan of closed wedges. I like the solidity and the breaking power that they offer. So what I typically do is a mix of those two approaches to the outside ashigarami system. When I lock up on my training partner, I will keep the sticky hook and rotate my knees to the inside so that I can lock up and expose that heel. Once I get the exposed heel, I use the sticky hook to dominate the speed of the spiral. When he goes to rotate through, I make it hard. Then when we come out the other side, I like the solidity of a closed wedge. So from this position, I simply raise my hips, pommel my foot out, and then lock that nice tight outside Ashigarami. So we get the best of both worlds. You had double trouble for a long period throughout most of the application of the heel hook, and then when it's time to finish, we simply make a switch into the favorite outside Ashigarami. You hit the strength and solidity of a closed wedge and finish. Let's have a look at that sequence again. We start off and enter with the double arimi. Both my opponent, the secondary leg controlled by my shoelaces, the primary leg controlled by the Ashigarami itself. Okay, I turn my knees to expose the heel. I don't make the switch to the far hip ashi. I just lock up here like so, and I use that sticky hook to slow down the speed of the spiral to the speed that I want. And as a result, when we put that pressure over, we can create that stationary opponent that we're looking for. We've stopped the spiral. Now that he's stopped, I feel there's a danger of him trying to pommel his foot in, for example. I would just take my foot over the top, pull in. Now we've got the safety and security of a closed wedge. When we lift the heel up now, we get that tremendous braking pressure. And in this sense, you're getting the best of both worlds. You've got the safety of foot position, the ability to dominate the speed of the spiral, the lack of back exposure, which is characteristic of the double arimi position and the use of that sticky hook. But then at the end of it, by taking your foot and pommeling it over to the outside Ashigarami, you've got the incredible security and braking potential of a closed wedge around your opponent's knee. Done in this fashion, you seize the best of both worlds and end up with a very, very strong, very, very robust way of applying your outside heel hooks.